Hey, what happened?
All right, guys, I am here with Neal Winokur. He's the grumpy accountant, and he wrote a book called "The Grumpy Accountant." What's the full name of it? The One Fed Up Tax Pros Practical Plan to Fix Canada's Senselessly Complicated Tax System. So it sounds like the tax system has made you a little grumpy there, Neal. Tell me a little bit about that. How long have you been an accountant, and when did you start getting grumpy?
Yeah, I've been an accountant for 10 long years. I don't know how I've lasted this long. I look at colleagues that I know, older guys that are in their 50s and 60s and 70s and still doing this, and I don't know how they do it for so long. I started to get grumpy pretty quickly um, once I started my own practice about 7 years ago, and I quickly started to really see how our tax system really works and affects people in a real way on a daily basis, especially if people who are self-employed or have a small business. The stress and the burdens that they have to go through and to comply with the tax system, it's just so complicated, so inefficient. There's so much inherent like irrationality in our tax system, and things which just don't make sense and are so counterintuitive, and all of this just made me really frustrated, and especially as I realized the job itself of a tax return filer, professional tax accountant, it shouldn't even exist. That's what I
Right.
started to realize. It's shameful that we have people with, not me, but other people with such brilliant minds, tax accountants and tax lawyers, that are, I feel, almost a waste of society's resources, that you
Right.
have these brilliant minds that are spending their time on, helping people comply with an overly complicated tax system.
Yeah, I mean that's one part of the tax burden that doesn't get thought of very much, right? We look at the amount of taxes that are deducted off our payroll or that we have to pay each year, but what we don't tabulate is how much time it takes us to prepare those returns, how much we have to pay professionals like you to help us navigate this system and file them. What would you say is, give us some sense of what kind of burden we're talking about there above and beyond the actual taxes that we're paying, but just trying to stay compliant with our tax code that we all have to pay as individuals.
Yeah, so first of all, there's the budget for the CRA. Because we have such a
Right.
complicated tax system, we have to administer that. So the CRA's budget is now almost $5 billion every year. And that wasn't the case like 10 years ago, 15 years ago.
Right.
Um,
And
so
one of the
that's one.
facts I noticed in your book, it's right in the preface, is that the CRA hires or employs 40,000 employees. And if we compare it to the US, the IRS employs 80,000. So twice as much for about 10 times as many people. So that's like 5 times per capita the number of tax workers we have in Canada. And is that because
Right.
of how complex our tax codes are in comparison to the US, or what is that?
Yeah, I mean, it is strange because the U.S. also has a complicated tax system, and in most states have their own tax authority that people have to deal with the state as well. So part of that difference is because Canada, the CRA, is is administering the tax system sort of provincially and federally, with the exception of Quebec. But it is
Right.
still, it shows that our tax system is too complicated, and especially when you compare our system to other parts of the world in Europe and other countries where they have way simpler systems than Canada and the US. So one
Right. I think you
cost,
point out
yeah,
in your book that in some places, with Sweden, like 70% of people don't even file returns.
yeah, in
In a lot of these places, they don't even file returns. I mean, that boggles my mind.
yeah, it's such a radically different way to envision a tax system, but it gets me very excited. So, and this is what I try to show in the book. If you're an employee and you get a T4 slip, so this is what they do in the United Kingdom and in quite a few other countries. Employees don't have to file tax returns because the employer is already doing it. I mean, even right now in Canada, this is already set up. Your T4 slip that you receive, the CRA already has it. They have your T4. So
Right.
if you make a mistake filing your tax return, you make a mistake in the T4 slip, the CRA will just correct it for you. So why do we have to do it in the first place if they already have the information?
Right,
Um,
right.
it's just an extra step. It's an extra burden. So there's the cost of the CRA. It's estimated that on average, Canadian households spend on average $500 a year to pay people like me to file their tax returns. It really shouldn't be that way. And that's a total of $7 billion a year. That's just individuals. So if you think
Right.
of corporations, every corporation has to file a tax return and they have to pay more. We have to charge small business corporations, and obviously the medium sized and large corporations pay a lot more, to a whole team of accountants and tax lawyers just to comply with the system. So that's on top of the burden, the actual tax burden, like you were saying, the physical amount we pay. There's all the time spent, people in just individual Canadians having to keep receipts on file for over 6 years, keeping all these documents in case the CRA asks to see them. Um, and it's often people's only interaction with the federal government every year is filing their tax return. And people are scared that they're doing something wrong, and they get scared when they receive letters from the CRA. So just philosophically, the way our system is set up, people are afraid of the government. And I don't, ideally, people should not be afraid of their government.
Right, right. Wow, yeah. And you point out, I think, in your book or on your website that, look, this should be a bipartisan, or like we should all be in unison, whether you are a libertarian like me who thinks taxation is theft, or you're a leftist who doesn't mind taxation at all and wants to use it to solve all the world's problems. The one thing we can all agree on is that this Canadian system is needlessly complicated and
Right.
burdensome to people. It doesn't need to be this burdensome. Taxes are burdensome enough. We don't need to add to that burden by making people spend hours out of their day preparing returns, or days, or like if you're a corporation, you probably, some corporations probably have whole tax departments just
Right.
devoted to making sure they're compliant with the CRA. Like the amount of time we have to devote to not get beaten with that big government stick
Yeah.
is something we should probably be able to avoid, and just leave it at the taxes. But it's not. Well, why do you think it is that we don't see a lot of pushback against this bureaucracy?
I think what's happened with the Canadian tax system is that we haven't had a formal comprehensive review of the tax system in over 50 years. So the
Hmm.
last time that happened it was called the Carter Commission, and they released a report in 1967. And since then, no political party has really wanted to touch this. So with every change in government, they tinker with the tax system. There's constant tinkering on
Right.
the edges, and there's new deductions and credits that get
Yeah.
added
Yeah.
in to satisfy certain special interest groups. But no one wants to do a full comprehensive review. Now, to their credit, Aaron O'Toole, the new leader of the Conservative Party, he has used the language in his campaign for their leadership race. He did use specific language of simplify the tax system. So we'll see what that means.
Right. 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 Well, yeah,
But
and
time will tell, I
I'm
guess.
never entirely trust these guys, right? Because I had a leader of a significant political party uh, here in Alberta once tell me, we were good friends, and he was a conservative though through and through, right? He had very libertarian, um, let's say, sympathies, but one thing he told me is, Tim, don't touch my tax credits though. Do not touch those. Okay. I know you
Yeah.
want a simple flat tax in your platform or whatever. That's the platform we had at the time, but don't touch the
Yeah.
tax credits, because they use them as political footballs, right? Because they can
Exactly.
appeal then to like groups that, like special interest groups, like maybe
Yeah.
it's farmers, or maybe it's families, or maybe it's
Yeah.
churches, or things that are associated with the conservative brand. They can use those tax credits as bribes.
Right.
And so I think that helps explain a little bit why there's some hesitance on both sides to
Yeah.
want to get rid of this complexity, because the complexity they can use to their advantage to buy votes, basically, in a sense.
Exactly. And that's what's happened historically. The Harper conservatives added in child fitness tax credit, child arts tax credit, public transit tax credit, home renovation tax credit. It just complicates the tax system. And then when Trudeau came into power, they eliminated a lot of those tax credits, but then they put in their own. They put in the
Right.
teachers' school supplies
Yeah. Yeah.
tax credit and the climate action incentive. So each party kind of they add deductions and credits that appeal to their favorite groups of voters. And the problem is there's constant changes. No one can keep track of it. So people have to hire professionals like me to keep track of it. And it just makes it so annoying. And it makes the CRA's job harder. It makes our jobs harder. And it really should be a nonpartisan issue where
Right.
everyone across the political spectrum should agree, let's have a simpler system in place like some other countries do. And we have to, in a way, de-politicize the tax system, which is hard
Right.
to wrap your head around, but it would
Yeah.
really help a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like I said, I think everyone, we can argue about what the rate of taxation should be, but there
Right.
should be no argument about this bureaucracy. Like, I can't imagine any party or any Canadian supports all this huge, monstrous bureaucracy that can be used as a cudgel when your ideological enemies get into power. They'll strip your tax
Exactly.
credits and implement their own tax credits. Let's just get rid of that. We can, if you're against cronyism
Right.
from corporations, the Liberals should be able to get behind that. And if you're
Right.
against pandering to unions and special interest groups on the left, well,
Right.
conservatives should be able to get behind that too. And I'm sure we all agree, let's just get rid of cronyism. I think that should be,
Right.
but anyways, I want to move on because
Sure.
your book is fantastic. It goes through like not just how complex the tax system is and where all your frustrations come from, but it also gives people some really valuable tips about how they can avoid paying more taxes and getting in trouble with the CRA and different things. I think the chapter that scared me the most, Neal, was probably chapter 8, where it talks about Pam suddenly getting a bill from the CRA and about how arbitrary the CRA can be. Can you talk a little bit about that story and what happened there?
Yeah, these are stories that all the stories I tell in the book are experiences that have happened to me, to my clients, and I change the
Right.
details a little bit, right? But
Yeah.
what the CR if someone fails to file their tax returns for a number of years, which happens because people put it off, they get busy, who knows? The CRA can do what's called an arbitrary assessment, which means they're basically filing the tax return for you, but they don't have all the information. So they can literally, I don't know what politicians came up with this law, this legislation, I don't know what they were thinking, but the CRA can estimate and make up these numbers based on past tax returns. And the problem with that, obviously, is that, well, in the years that the CRA is arbitrarily assessing a return, they might not have had the same income they
Right.
had in
Right. Right.
prior years. They might have had
Yeah.
zero income. So that happens. And the CRA does that to kind of, encourage people and motivate them to file the real tax return, which will then
Right.
remove the arbitrary assessment. But it's a whole bureaucratic
Yeah. Yeah.
nightmare
Well,
because
the
it takes a
story
lot
you
of time.
tell is one of this lady, Pam,
Yeah.
who suddenly gets a $25,000 tax notice. Now, she hadn't been filing taxes for a number of years, and you pinpointed it to a time when she last filed her taxes where she actually did some contract work on the side, made about $25,000. And then what the CRA did was they said, oh, well, she's making that amount of money every year over the past 8 years, even though it was just that 1 year, that one
Right.
time. And so your advice in the book is, file your taxes on term. And that really jabbed me right in the gut because, CRA, put on your earmuffs and shut off this podcast. I don't want you to hear what I'm about to say. But I haven't filed my tax return in probably 5 or 6 years. And like every year that goes by, it's like, oh my God, it seems even more onerous to now try to file, and the cost of it, everything else, and the time trying to round up the paperwork and everything. I mean, I've been paying taxes. I've had it deducted off my payroll. I should probably file. I'll probably get money back if anything.
You'll get income tax refunds, and I don't know your family situation, but if you have children, you'd be getting Canada Child benefits, and so I always tell people, always file your tax return every year and even if you have no income, and that's one of the tips in the book, because if you have no income, the government just gives people GST credits. It's free. Well, it's not free money, but
Right.
it's
Sure.
for that individual, it's tax-free money. If you're below a certain income, you get GST credits. If your family income is below a certain amount, you receive Canada Child benefits, but you won't receive any of this money if you don't file your tax return.
Right.
So
Okay,
it's
but
very
Neal,
important.
let's come back to me for a second here. Let's
Sure,
talk about
yeah.
me. What
Yeah.
what what what's your advice to me? Should I just do this on my own? Should I hire a tax professional? Give me some words of encouragement or motivation to get me off my ass and actually
Okay.
file this thing. What's the easiest way? What's the most painless way to get this done?
Okay. If you have simple returns, like you have a T4 slip every year,
Yeah.
and if you don't have much else involved, it's really actually it's pretty easy. My book sort of makes it seem like it's very hard, but it
Right.
in certain ways it is, but in certain ways it's not. You can download TurboTax or UFile. There's even a website where you could file for free. I think it's called simpletax.ca. And there's another one, Studio Tax. You just go
Okay.
online and you just input your information, your name, your SIN number. And if you put your SIN number in, you can then autofill directly from what CRA has on file for you. So the CRA has your
Oh,
T4
nice.
slip already every year. And then it's basically done.
Okay. And if
Obviously,
I
you want to
don't have
don't.
my T4 slips from certain years, what happens then? Do I have to track
So
down that employer or can I get them from CRA?
you can get it from you can track down the employer, but you can also get it from CRA. What I would suggest, and I put this in the book as well, you go to CRA, you just go on Google and type in CRA my account, and the
Right.
link will come up, my account for individuals. You could set up your online account with CRA. Maybe I shouldn't be telling people this because they just had another data breach, I think
Oh,
last
man.
week or 2 weeks ago. Yeah, that happens
I don't care
sometimes.
about my privacy. China and the government and the NSA, they're all free to know everything about my life. But yeah, I'm unusual that
Yeah.
way.
Yeah. So if you have your My Account set up, in that, I recommend everyone set that up because in your CRA My Account, they have all your past 10 years of all your tax information. They have your T4 slips, notice of assessments, all your information is
Right.
right there. So it's really easy.
Okay.
You just get the T4 slip and start. I would file each year one at a time. So
Right.
and go in order.
Okay.
Um, and yeah, don't be overwhelmed by it. Like I know it seems overwhelming, but if you stay on top of it throughout the year, like if you can keep organized, scan in receipts as you get
I
them,
can't keep
keep.
organized, Neal. I can't do it. Sorry. I'm terrible. I need I need to move you in here and just have you deal with that. Okay.
Yeah.
We've talked about my nightmare scenario. Let's talk about some other nightmares and things people might not know about the tax. What are the things that you think, maybe one or the top three things that people would be surprised to know, or about the CRA and about the tax system we have here?
Okay, well, one thing I found interesting, I read an article and I had to put it in my book while it was being edited. Guess how many phone calls the CRA receives every year? Their call centers.
Oh man, probably like a million or something. I don't know.
53 million.
Oh,
Okay. Yeah. So they're dealing, they're dealing with,
jeez.
yeah, they're dealing with like a big workload here. So that's one interesting thing I found interesting, that the burden, like that's where you see the cost is. And everyone who's calling the CRA is waiting on hold, right? Sometimes you get through right away. So I always tell people, if you have to call CRA, call first thing in the morning, call at 9 a.m. or 8 a.m. when their office opens,
Right.
because you have a better chance of getting through. So that's one
And
interesting
they're out
thing.
east, right? Like they're in.
Well, they have all over the country. They have tax
Okay.
centers. Yeah, there's offices all over.
Okay.
Yeah, some of the bigger ones are PEI. There's Quebec. There's Sudbury Tax Center. There's Winnipeg. They have all over the place. Um, I would say another interesting thing for people who are self-employed or have a small business, a lot of people always forget that they have to pay in installments throughout the year, right?
Right.
So here's an interesting thing about how we often don't think about this, but if you think about how is tax actually collected, who actually does it? It's not employees, right? It's employers and business owners. They are
Right.
unpaid tax collectors.
Yes.
They
Yes.
GST, HST. Oh, I know what book. Yes, I read that book. I loved it.
Yeah. Our former party leader, Jean-Serge Brisson, wrote all about that. He fought the government, and I
Right.
think he actually won, but he contended that if he was going to have to collect taxes for them, that he should
Yes.
be on their payroll.
Right.
So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, so every business owner in the country is forced to collect GST or HST. And also, as soon as you become an employer, you have to deduct the tax from your employee's paycheck. But it's not just income tax, it's CPP, EI, and it's not easy to calculate that. It's actually very difficult. Most people
Right.
who have an employee, they have to hire a payroll service provider or an accountant or a bookkeeper who does payroll to
Hmm.
help them with that. It's a big cost. And it's true, they can deduct the cost of that on their own tax return. It's deductible expense, but they're not getting paid for all the time and in terms of that time spent on complying and being a tax collector. So it's always like fascinating me how the majority, when you think about it, the vast majority of people in Canada are employees. I think there's about 2 million or 2 to 3 million self-employed people in Canada, but the rest, the majority are employees who don't really, this is the problem, they don't really understand how difficult it is
Right.
for their employers.
Yeah.
Anyone who has a small business, even if you're self-employed and you're your only employee, it's just you.
Right.
You can be a one-man
Well, and
shop.
evidence of that is that you're either having to pay a bit more tax or get something back at the end of the year, right? So that tells you that your employer hasn't precisely calculated on your behalf or whatever. Let me ask
Yeah,
you this. Again, I'm coming back to my own situation here in my family. I
sure.
got to pick your brain because, you're an expert here. It occurred to me when you're talking about the difficulty small business had. Well, my daughter, she's an employee, as a paramedic, but she also has a side hustle with
Yeah,
with a small business. She has a makeup consulting thing, and I think she hires some girls to help her out with different events and different things, and she just
yeah.
pays them as contractors. But what advice should she be paying attention to with regards to taxes, and keeping track and all that kind of thing? What should she have, some kind of bookkeeper? Should she, what's your advice? What are the pitfalls here?
Yeah. So anyone who has their own little business, no matter how small, there's a few basic things they have to do. They have to keep receipts for every expense that they want to claim. So these
Right.
contractors that she's paying, those contractors ideally should give her an invoice, and then she should pay them based on the invoice and keep the invoices.
Right.
Um, she should have a system of bookkeeping that she's doing throughout the year, updating monthly or updating every 2 weeks. I recommend QuickBooks Online. It's for younger people who are tech savvy. It's great. It's very user friendly. You can connect your bank account and credit card right into the system,
Oh,
and
nice.
it automatically downloads every single transaction on a daily basis. So
Beautiful.
you basically you don't really have to do bookkeeping. You just one click categorize each transaction
And
as
she
it
has
comes
one of
into the
those
feed.
credit card swipers for iPhone or whatever. When she's at an
Yeah,
event, people
it's
that would
Stripe.
connect. Yeah,
Stripe, I think
Stripe,
yeah,
or yeah,
whatever it's
whatever it
called.
is.
Yeah, that's
So
great.
I'm
And
guessing.
that connects, yeah, that
Perfect.
connects
Okay.
right into QuickBooks Online. So all her revenue could be right in there, and then all the expenses are there. And she should keep all the receipts. And anyone who's self-employed, like I said, they have to set aside some of their revenue because they might have a tax bill at the end of the year. Because
Right.
when you're an employee, tax is taken off your check. So at the end of the year, you don't owe anything, and usually you get a refund. Anyone who
Right.
has their own business
They got
has
to
to
pay.
pay tax at the end of the year.
And what about people that are tempted to slide under the radar, go under the table? Like what are the dangers there?
Yeah.
How does the CRA find out about these people that are doing things under the table?
Yeah, Canada has a huge underground economy, obviously because we have income tax rates which are too high, and we have in most provinces you have sales tax rates which are too high. So it's a win-win for people. And not only that, you have Canada child benefits being paid out based on how high your family income is. So the lower income you show, the lower taxes you pay and the more benefits you get back. So we've created these perverse incentives. That's a big problem. But the CRA goes after these types of things. They sometimes they're actually very clever. They'll look at your postal code. So for example, let's say your postal code is in Forest Hill in Toronto, like one of the most expensive neighborhoods in Toronto, but you're showing zero income. They might say, how are you affording to live in Forest Hill if you don't have any income? Now maybe that person had a big inheritance or won the lottery or something and they don't have taxable income. It's possible, right? But if there's no valid explanation, maybe they'll look into things a little more. They might also look at people's tax returns. Let's say anyone who's self-employed, most self-employed people, they'll show some income. So people who are doing underground, doing things under the table, they still show some income because they know they can't show zero. So the
Right.
CRA might look at their tax return, and based on the business that they're in, because when you file a tax return as self-employed, you have to show there's like a million different these 6-digit codes that shows what the nature of your business is. Like, are you a plumber? Are you an electrician? Are you a writer? Are you a graphic designer? Are you a personal trainer? Whatever it is, you have to show that. And then the CRA might compare it to other people in your industry. And if
Mm.
your income is well below the average of everyone else in the industry, maybe they'll question it. So they might do what's called, I think they call it like a net worth audit, a net asset audit, where they look at your lifestyle. Are you driving fancy cars and living in a fancy house and you're only showing $20,000 of income? So they do have a way of looking at those things, but it's
Right.
difficult. And that's why people say, like, because of, I'm sure you know the Laffer curve, right? As the
Right.
tax rate gets too high, the government actually collects less.
Right.
And if the tax rates were a little lower, they would collect more because more people would come up from underground.
Right. Right. Okay. So we talked a little bit about how like the CRA can detect cheating. What are the consequences of cheating? What happens if you just refuse to pay taxes? You get caught. You refuse to pay the fines. Like what can the CRA do to you? Um,
I,
what are the
well,
consequences?
well, the first step is, if you have unpaid tax bills, eventually you'll start receiving notices of collection from the collections department. You'll receive these letters, and then you'll start to receive phone calls. So I would imagine most people, once they start, once a taxpayer's unpaid tax balance goes to the collections department, they have very strict procedures that they follow, and they go through the procedures. Now, if it got to a point where a taxpayer just kept ignoring them and ignoring them and ignoring them, that's a good question. I've never dealt with that specifically, but in theory, eventually, um, there could be serious fines and imprisonment. I mean,
Right.
if someone doesn't file tax returns, that's what happened to Pam in my book. They just file it for you, and they'll assess you a large amount of tax owing with a big balance owing. Um, some people end up declaring bankruptcy to
Yeah.
avoid paying these CRA debts. That's a common occurrence, actually. And there's special tax returns they file in the year of bankruptcy,
And I
which get
think
pretty
it's worth
complicated.
noting too that, I mean, anyone who declares bankruptcy, taxation had to play a part in that. I mean, if if you have upwards of 40% of your wealth or income taxed every year, that has to play a part in you declaring bankruptcy. So, when people say that, in the US, if you get sick, it could bankrupt you. While in Canada, if other people get sick, it could bankrupt you. Because anytime someone gets bankrupt in Canada, a
Yeah.
big part of that is because of the taxes they pay. And half the income taxes that are collected go to pay for healthcare. So healthcare is bankrupting a lot of people in this country. I just thought I'd throw that in there. But
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I didn't think of it like that, but yeah, it's a good point. And also, it's important to note that when the CRA charges penalties and interest, there is a way to request relief of penalties and interest. So
hmm,
taxpayers, if you receive a notice of assessment and they assess penalties and interest on it, um, you could file a request. It's a special department called taxpayer relief. And it's actually one of my pet peeves of the CRA that they'll charge, and it's not the CRA's fault, because it's really the Department of Finance that makes the laws. They are responsible for the legislation. The CRA has to implement it. They don't have a choice.
right.
But sometimes the CRA will actually charge penalties if you miss a T slip in your tax return. And that's one of the things I hate the most, because a T slip, by definition, automatically goes to the CRA. So if you have an investment that pays you a dividend, and the bank gives you a T5 slip, which shows the dividend income, the bank also files that T5 slip to the CRA, just like your employer files your T4 to CRA. CRA already has the T5. But
Hmm,
people often make mistakes when they file their tax return. They leave out a T slip, and the CRA charges a penalty. And it's like,
Jeez.
why are you charging a penalty? You have the slip. Just reassess the return, which sometimes they do. Sometimes I've seen where they reassess it, they include the extra income, they don't charge a penalty, but sometimes they do charge a penalty, and it's a sometimes like it's sometimes arbitrary, and it's just like that's one thing I say in the book. What the CRA should immediately right now, this is one thing that can be done, and this would be nonpartisan, doesn't require like years of study. Just stop charging penalties when people forget a T-slip,
Right,
because
right.
there's no way to evade or hide income that's reported on a T-slip by
Yeah, yeah.
definition.
Yeah, I saw a meme about this one. I'm trying to remember it, but it was basically, give us the money you owe. How
Oh
much money
yeah,
do we owe you? Well,
you
uh,
calculate it.
w-
Yeah,
we 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 know exactly how much it is, but you have to calculate it. And if you
yeah,
calculate it wrong, we're going to charge you more.
exactly.
Yeah, it's just
It's
absolutely
crazy.
asinine.
I I I I like to use um, an analogy. Imagine you go to the grocery store, okay, and you put all your groceries on the thing, and the cashier, instead of the cashier giving you a bill, they say, here's a 3,000-page document called the Grocery Bill Act.
Right.
And you read this and you figure out your grocery bill. And
Yeah.
remember, there's a lot of deductions and credits you can claim to lower your
Yeah.
grocery bill, because
Yeah.
maybe you have medical expenses, or you made some donations, or your child was in a fitness program. And now you're like, what? Oh my God, I have to hire a
Yeah.
grocery
Oh,
bill
and by the
professional.
way, if you get it wrong, we're gonna fine
Charge
you.
you penalties. Yeah.
Yeah, we're gonna
And then
charge you
there's the
penalties.
grocery. Yeah. And there's the grocery store revenue agency, the GRA, and they're going to administer the filing of grocery bills. No one would put up with this. We would all be like, hey, this is insane. Let me just pay my grocery bill in the simplest, fastest way possible.
Yeah, yeah,
And we don't do this with any other bill. You get your car insurance renewal. It's pretty simple. It says, here's the amount, right? You get your
yeah,
phone bill, your utility bill, any other bill. Here's the amount you owe, you pay it. And you don't have to hire a professional to help you. I mean, it's so insane. And this is why I felt like an obligation to write this book, because I didn't want to go through my whole life not trying to do something about this,
yeah.
because it bothers me so much.
Yeah. Okay. So you talked about one thing, that easy fix that we could reform things and make things a lot better right now, and that is just have the CRA autofill in the T form stuff into your tax return. That they have that information. And then I guess if you have extra deductions and stuff, you can add that in yourself. But what are some other things, recommendations? So your book, by the way, is great, and it goes through all the problems and tips to avoid getting into trouble with the CRA and maximizing your return. So, I highly recommend everyone pick up The Grumpy Accountant. Um, I heard a rumor that you might be thinking about another book down the road, and maybe that one would be solution oriented. What if you were to write that book, Neal? What would be some of the solutions or fixes that you might be recommending for the
Yeah,
system?
sure. Well, in this book, I do have a whole bunch of solutions, which I feel are really good and common sense, and most people would agree on. So, for example, like the number one solution is we have to eliminate and abolish every single tax deduction and credit from the tax return, and then you simply lower the tax rate to make up the difference. And if
Right,
we did that, imagine if there were no deductions and credits, the T4 would become the tax return, and there would be no tax return to file for an employee who has no other income, which is
right,
most tax filers. So right there, we would we'd be able to cut the series budget probably by a third right there, at least 25%, maybe more. And we would save the the burden for millions of employees in Canada would not have to file a tax return.
right.
Now, for anyone
But
who's
what about all the
self
jobs of those CRA workers and your job, Neal? I mean, like,
look, accountants, yeah, accountants will have to adapt. Most accountants don't, it's not like most accountants who do what I do, we don't only file personal tax returns. Most of our work is small businesses, and that work would still exist. Although I also propose to massively simplify that, which would write me out of a job. Um, but it's worth it because it would really help these people. So, and yeah, the employees at CRA would look, they'd have to be retrained and work somewhere else. I mean, it's not, it's not fair for millions of Canadians to have to suffer so those 40,000 people could have a job. It doesn't make sense. It's not right. I
Yeah.
mean, again,
They'd
we
have
wouldn't
to
do that
find
with our
honest
gross.
work.
Yeah, it's not like we would do that with our grocery bills, right? If, oh, we can hire 40,000 new employees if we made our grocery bills a lot more complicated. Like we would never do that. So why do we continue with this? Um, so one thing we could do for self-employed people, because even under a simple tax system, like in the UK, I think it's 87 or 90% of people in the UK don't have to file. And it's only if you have like very high income or if you're self-employed, then you have to report your income. But we can make it a lot simpler for self-employed people. So what I recommend is kind of a similar idea. Right now, if you're self-employed, you have to show an income statement that's like 6 pages long that has every single expense by category. You have to keep every receipt. You basically have to be a bookkeeper or hire a bookkeeper. It's a big burden for people. So what I propose is forget about the expenses. Let self-employed people report their revenue and just pay a lower rate of tax to reflect the fact that they're not claiming expenses, right? So what I say is give them the option. So if some self-employed people want to show all their expenses because they feel that might be more beneficial, give them like a simplified option. They can have option A, option B, and they can choose which way they want to file. And in either way, it should be a one-page tax return. A tax return should never be more than 1 page. So those are like a couple things we could do. Another thing you could do, you could eliminate and abolish RRSPs, TFSAs, RESPs, all of these accounts which are to help people to encourage people to save money for their retirement. We could eliminate those and you just lower the tax rates dramatically to make up the difference. And with a much lower tax rate, people would be more encouraged to save. So
Right.
we made our system so complicated. Politicians think that we need to be micromanaged at every stage in life. Every life
Yeah.
event needs a tax credit. You're buying a house? Oh, you need a tax credit. You have children in childcare? Tax credit. You have to pay for some medical expense that's not covered by the government or insurance? Tax credit. You make a donation? Tax credit. Like every little thing has to have a tax credit deduction, but it makes it so complicated. So the way to really change this and simplify it is we have to depoliticize the system, get rid of every deduction and credit. You lower the tax rate. And if we did that, I actually calculated, we could raise the basic exemption so that minimum amount that everyone would be exempt from tax to almost $50,000, which is basically the first federal tax bracket, up to about $48,000. And that covers about 65%. The bottom 65% of taxpayers would not have to pay income tax. So there's different opinions on the basic exemption.
Right.
Some people don't like it. They think everyone should have some skin in the game. Other people think, no, we shouldn't charge income tax to people who can't really afford it. So there's different opinions on that, but I like the idea of a basic exemption.
Yeah.
But there are different views. But that's basically how you do it. You get rid of the deductions and credits and you lower the rates.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that was essentially our tax platform in 2015. We basically said, well, let's raise the exemption. I think it was to 17 or 18,000.
Yeah.
At 15% flat tax across the board, no deductions, no credits or anything like that. And then we had 4 things that raised the exemption to, I think, 30,000 if you were a senior, if you were a student, if you were disabled, and there was one more thing that would raise the basic exemption. And we figured, okay, like based on the Laffer curve, the government will actually still be making just as much money as they do under the current regime. Now I've become a bit more radical since then. I'm envisioning a society where we don't fund the government through theft. But a transition to that, if we cut out all the things that we libertarians don't think the government should be involved in and stick strictly to a night watchman state, police, military, courts, we could fund our government just with the GST we currently have. So we could eliminate the income tax, just go to GST. You can kind of avoid GST if you buy things used or it's voluntary to some degree, and then transition eventually to, I've always thought even a flat tax was unfair because no one plays a a flat percentage of their income when they're buying things in the store. Everyone gets charged the same amount. Like a pack of gum is the same
Right.
price, no matter whether you're a millionaire or you're barely scraping to get by.
Right.
So I thought, well, why shouldn't government, the price of government be about the same?
Right.
So, I toyed around with the idea of a head tax, which is just a flat fee. If you want to, and it's voluntary, if you want the right to vote, you
Uh-huh.
pay the flat tax, whatever it is,
Yeah.
7,000, 10,000, and you
Interesting.
pay
Yeah.
that, you get to vote. But that was pretty controversial. Not everyone liked that, but you know, so I went back to the kind of the fair tax, or the consumption tax idea. That was
Right.
my idea. We could basically eliminate the CRA with that type of proposal. We could get rid of all
Yeah.
this bureaucracy. We could make taxes somewhat voluntary,
Yeah.
in that you can avoid paying GST in certain ways, right?
Right.
But yeah, I completely agree. So, Neal, is there anything else you want to send out to Liberty Experts Nation? Any other advice? Where can people buy your book? Where can they find out more about the Grumpy Accountant?
Sure. Yeah. So, the Grumpy Accountant, the paperback is on Amazon.ca, and the ebook is available everywhere, wherever you read your ebooks. And the audiobook is now out as well. So if you want to listen
Oh,
to me
nice.
rant on for 5 hours, instead of reading it, you can buy the audiobook on Audible and Amazon and Apple Books, and everywhere else. I have a website, grumpyaccountant.ca, where there's some videos, and you can read the introduction to the book on grumpyaccountant.ca. And also, I've written some articles that were in the National Post and the postmillennial.com, and they're also posted on my website on the blog page. I would just say that I wrote this book in a way that would try to appeal to people across the political spectrum. So in my ideal world also, I like the idea of a night watchman state, of a very limited government, and a much lower burden of tax. But in the Grumpy Accountant, at least in this, version one, I had to sort of stay away from, like, okay, can we abolish all of income tax and
Yeah,
abolish or
of
limit the
course. Yeah,
government? I tried to find a revenue neutral plan to simplify
right.
the tax system as a first step. And I wrote the book as a story. So if you're afraid of reading a book about tax, this book reads like when you're reading it, you're reading a novel about Jerry and George and Elaine. It's written as a story
Mm-hmm.
with these characters, and it's a fun read. So,
Well, yeah,
yeah,
and these are all pragmatic suggestions. Well, first of all, there's lots of practical advice for you to protect yourself from the government and the tax man right here, right now. But this overarching theme of let's simplify things, let's get rid of the bureaucracy and the burden. I mean, that's something that appeals to libertarians, but it also appeals to everyone else, conservatives, liberals. I mean,
yeah,
no one, so you've hit something that I think can get broad appeal, and,
yeah.
and it limits government. So as a libertarian, I'm happy about that. So I definitely would recommend people get this book. And Neal, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me on.